My name is Jake Zaslav, and I am part of Monument for Memory. Um, so, some background on me: I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in the U.S. And if you don't know about Richmond, we've been in the news a lot lately because there's a giant street, which is one of the main streets in Richmond, called Monument Avenue, and it's filled with monuments to Confederate generals. And so every day, um, growing up, I would pass by these huge, grand monuments to people who dedicated their lives to preserving slavery and were put up by people who intended to maintain white supremacy and intimidate and change history. Um, but in the past few days, we've seen this huge reclamation by protesters of these monument spaces. As you can see here, not only through adding context to the monument through graffiti that highlight injustices and some of the problems that these monuments reinforce, but also how it's become really a community space. Around the monument, there are all of these memorials to people who have been shot by the police, who have died at the hands of the police. And on the weekends, it serves as a space for barbecues and celebrations and voter registration. Um, so with that in mind, one thing my group wanted to do with this project was create a model for what a contemporary monument can be, one that reclaims the idea of monuments for the community that they're in. And so to do that, we created Monument for Memory, an immersive media sculpture housed in an interactive 3D digital space that uses film, photographs, sound, and found objects to create an ethnographic assemblage to center the stories of members of the community in which it is built for and by.
So coming off Jake's lightning talk about the film rooms, we started discussing the material quality of media and the ways in which we might express memory and a layered kind of ephemerality, as well as composite the eventual collages themselves. And so on the left here, we have Ella Boyd's work that looks at refraction and reflection. And then Do Ho Su's work, which examines the concepts of home and space in a very unique way. And then we also started looking at more examples in our brainstorm iterative phase in this past week. So there's the Exquisite Forest by Google and Tate. That was a browser-based branching narrative experience that users could contribute to. And then Line of Control by Subodh Gupta for its powerful structural presentation. And then more concretely, for the resulting prototype and approach, the 3D video sculpture on the left there by Masaki Fujihata called Voices of Aliveness, which is a database of people's recordings that they added to this composite. And then this inflatable balloon pavilion called Scum, which is a Danish word for foam, that we later in the process brought up as a way to explore what a sculptural installation might look like in 3D. And so the talk about how this sculpture would arise and present itself, we started talking and exploring the idea of verticality and how we might catalog and archive a media collection going upwards, and reconfiguring what site-specific might look like within a digital space. And so our first shot was in Vectorworks with a more literal attempt, but we found abstraction would work in our favor, considering the types of spaces we were all considering making. And so there was discussion around how a user might navigate as well. And so bringing back to the potential permeability of materials in a digital space, we abandoned the idea of having doors and walkways and instead emphasized and encouraged a more fluid and flowing experience. And so the eventual structure was created in Cinema 4D, which we then imported to Unity, where we created and compiled everything.
So we see this project as being kind of this larger prototype or framework for kind of developing maybe a larger project where it's sort of this monument that is sort of a constellation or kind of a collage of efforts where people can sort of submit or participate in giving us content to include in our sculpture. And this week we sort of workshopped different ideas, especially around multimedia. So we all sort of worked across different storytelling tools from video, 360 video, photographs, and also working with photogrammetry with the free app Displayland. So what's important to us, I think, during this is to sort of work with technologies that are accessible um, to diverse communities. So to sort of destigmatize this idea that immersive tech is kind of this expensive or kind of complicated hardware, we want to work with kind of these tools that can be accessed across a diverse set of communities and abilities. Um, and I think kind of working with these inexpensive and accessible tools, it sort of opens up this idea of kind of museums and exhibition spaces that can be sort of collaborative and that are sort of multi-authored. And we're interested in the idea of this multimedia almost archive. And through kind of, I think, working in multimedia and in these immersive spaces, we can sort of open up these ideas of archiving memory that is more sensory, that is more embodied, that might be sort of erased or displaced in kind of stereotypical or classical archives or museum spaces. So I think there's a lot to play with there in terms of how we come up with content and the media that we use.
Great. So what we ended up with was a Unity 3D app for both Mac and Windows that can be downloaded via a link from a Google Drive. One thing that's really important to us is making this software accessible to the communities and designed specifically for the communities which it's attempting to memorialize. So we took the challenge of how can we, and the partnership between tMoRPH and the Yukon, looking at how can we make this software accessible for people in the Yukon. So we had a few ways that we did that. One was through accessible hardware. So our program, while it's immersive, it doesn't rely on expensive hardware like VR headsets to enjoy. And it requires limited CPU and RAM load that allows it to be played on just a normal laptop. We also have a minimal reliance on the internet. The file has been minimized to only 250 megabytes. So while it is an investment in time for people in the Yukon to download, it is nowhere near the amount of time that a movie would take or a lot of other applications, and is still fairly doable. Furthermore, all the content has been front-loaded into the app. So after the initial download, there's no internet access required for use. And then finally, we wanted to look at community distribution. When we had the AMA with the Yukoners, one thing that was brought up was how there's often a community distribution of media to deal with issues of limited bandwidth. So someone may download one thing, put it onto a hard drive, and then pass it along to other people so that they can download it directly from the hard drive rather than from the internet. So by uploading it to Google Drive as just a downloadable zip file, we avoid traditional app marketplace and we make it a lot easier for users in the Yukon to transfer the app from one to one another.
So thinking about next steps with this project, one of the things we're thinking about is sort of the strategies for curating and creating and sort of crowdsourcing content, and also kind of real world applications that this project could be used for. So we started off, I think, kind of the scope of this project being more sort of a global effort, and even sort of through this hackathon, experimenting, kind of collaborating across time and space. But so I think the next sort of steps with this is to look at how this project might serve more kind of local communities, and how maybe we see this working really well in the context of working with remote communities on the ground. So even kind of doing more participative like workshops, storytelling workshops on the ground with communities, working with these tools that I sort of described, with these technologies and media creation tools, and then sort of bringing it in and adapting it to the virtual space. That's one thing we're thinking about, as well as possibly how can we sort of collaborate virtually through low-tech means. So if that's sort of mailing each other content, or there's been interesting projects, documentary projects, of having people sort of phone call in and sort of recording oral histories that way. So those are sort of the next steps we're thinking about.
As well, we talked about some improvements in design that we might look into investigating and seeing how they could potentially apply, like increasing immersion, improving the movement mechanics so that we have a more embodied and varied interaction with the environment, as well as researching those distribution models we've touched upon.
Wonderful. And we have here a link to be able to download it, which anyone in this, anyone can actually download and play this app, play our little our example of what a framework could be like. It's bit.ly/monument4memory.